The US has pushed for multiple rounds of sanctions against Iran, supposedly to discourage them from building a nuke, even though the CIA and Mossad both agree that the Iranian leadership hasn't even made the decision to build a bomb, much less even start. The US and Israeli governments aren't one to let pesky little things like facts keep them from promoting military strikes on Iran. But since they haven't gotten much traction with this approach from the international community, they've moved on to less direct tactics. And that brings us to Syria. Iran's closest ally is Syria. And on Friday, May 3rd, 2013, Israel attacked Syria. This after their attempt at framing the Syrian government for chemical weapons fell apart. The US has been stepping up its material support for the Syrian rebels, though they still publicly claim that they aren't supplying them with weapons. This is just a public relations smokescreen. On May 26, Lebanon was attacked by NATO-backed insurgents due to Hezbollah's support for the Syrian government. Russia has taken a firm stand against US, NATO, and Israeli attempts to topple the Syrian government, and is still planning to send a shipment of S-300 anti-aircraft missiles to the country. In response, Israel's President Netanyahu reportedly warned Putin that Moscow's sale of the sophisticated missile defense system to Assad could push the Middle East into war, and argued that the S-300 had no relevance to Assad's internal battles against rebel groups. This statement, coming right on the heels of the unprovoked Israeli airstrikes on Damascus this month, leaves little doubt as to what these missiles are intended for and why Israel is angry. Of course, Netanyahu doesn't like this. He wants to be able to continue attacking Syria with impunity. Now, this past week, Russia moved a group of warships from their Pacific Fleet into the Eastern Mediterranean for the first time in decades to, quote, protect Russia's interest in the region. This move counters the US naval presence, which has built up in the area over the past several years. Both of these moves are direct statements about their intentions regarding Syria and Iran. This is only a rough summary of the early stages of this conflict. Much is being left out here. But this should be enough to establish this is indeed a world war. Now, as for the players, how are they divided? Who's allied with who? On one side we have China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and a handful of nations in South America. The role of the South American nations in this conflict has been strictly economic, but as we'll discuss later, economics is central in this crisis. On the other side we have the United States, Israel, and NATO, which includes most of Western Europe, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and a handful of others. So clearly the most powerful nations in the world are involved. If tomorrow a direct war between the United States and Russia were to break out, this would mark the official beginning of World War III. But obviously this wouldn't really be accurate. A proxy war between the US and Russia is already underway in Syria and in Iran, and a currency war is already underway between the United States and China. The question here is really only one of scale. How far will this go? Will the US and its allies back down before this escalates into an open war involving the big players? Obviously it's impossible to answer that question with 100% certainty. These are human decisions, and even madmen sometimes have moments of lucidity. However, when you understand why these wars are happening, it becomes clear that it is highly unlikely that the US and its allies will back down. So why is this happening? What is the motive for this aggressive posture by the United States and its allies? We talked about this in detail in a number of videos, including The Road to World War III, which explains the history of the petrodollar and how it pertains to this current conflict. So we won't rehash all those details here. But to summarize, this war is a war for the control of the global financial system. The dollar is nearing the end of its days, and the powers that be know this. They could let the dollar fall and allow the rest of the world to choose their own course. They don't want to. The powers that be would much rather take a gamble and stake it all in an attempt to control the currency that will replace the dollar. If they have it their way, this new currency will be a truly global currency.
I think we've all got to move towards that opportunity, and I think the challenge also is whether we should move towards an international currency, because the speculation and the complexity of currency has caused some of the irritation, not only among the trading nations, but among individuals.
This global currency will be accompanied by global government, which they will claim is necessary to prevent another tragic war like the one they're setting off right now. It's a classic problem-reaction-solution setup, where those that create the problem manipulate the public into accepting a solution that puts more power into their hands. They are going to attempt this one way or another. If they don't, then they will lose everything. The question is, how will we respond? Will you fall for this? Will you send your sons and daughters to fight in these corrupt wars with your eyes closed and your hand on your heart? Or will you at least speak out? This is the real variable. This is what will determine the final outcome. If you appreciate this message and if you want others to hear it, you can help by liking